So anyway, Forrest was part of the McAllister delegation to the Paris talks on climate change. And that's about all I'm going to say, but anything more you want to share with us? Like, for example, I learned how you came to McAllister. I thought that was a wonderful story. If you
Oh,
want to
yeah?
share that, people.
I can start with that,
Okay.
if you'd like.
Start with that.
Okay,
People
cool.
are arriving.
No problem. Yeah, so I kind of am going to structure this kind of how we can kind of talk as we go, but also just give some like short stories about specifically my experience in Paris. But before doing that, I'll give a little bit of background about myself, and then how it came to pass that McAllister sent students to Paris, and kind of share a little bit about that background. But the story of how I ended up here was I attended a liberal arts high school in Tempe, Arizona, and kind of fell in love with the Socratic method, the kind of dialectic approach to education. And so I applied to a series of like small liberal arts schools around the country. And I was actually visiting Grinnell in Iowa, if you're familiar with that school, kind of another pretty solid school in the Midwest. And I was on the way back from Grinnell and was snowed in Minneapolis. That was my first experience in Minneapolis, was like a 16-hour flight delay. So fitting, I think, coming from Arizona to have that be my first experience, but I was going to get a hotel and whatnot. And I'm a varsity athlete at McAllister. I play football for the school. And one of the coaches just called me up randomly and just was checking in on a recruitment call. And I said, well, you wouldn't believe it, I happen to be in Minnesota right now. I'm going to get a hotel. Like, it's cool to hear from you. He said, absolutely not. You're not going to get a hotel. He sent one of the current players to pick me up at midnight from the airport in this blizzard. Right? And I slept at this young man's house, got a chance to meet a few players on the team, never even stepped foot on the campus. And the coach picked me up in the next morning and took me back to the airport. And when people asked me how I came to McAllister, I kind of harken back to that story, because there was other factors, good financial aid, good school and whatnot. But it just seemed like a place with good people and a place I could fit in. So that's kind of what pushed me here. I do. I'm a varsity football player from McAllister. I've played 3 years and going into my senior season, so exciting time. Yeah. So I guess some background on the course. So as you said, I'm an economics major, but like to embody the liberal arts approach to education too, an environmental studies minor, and international development concentrator at McAllister. So trying to have my feet in a lot of different places, but have been really interested, prompted by my family as well, by climate change and sustainability questions across the front, beyond environmental, but social and economic as well. And there was a course at McAllister that was offered called Paris Dispatches, which was a semester-long course that then took 10 student delegates to the Paris conferences for the first week of the conference. And so it was an application-based course, and students applied, and if you were accepted, you had this semester course and kind of broke into smaller teams and tried to learn as much as you could about the UN negotiation process. And I will admit, I wouldn't call myself a UN expert by any means. I think the more we delved into it, we realized how incredibly complicated the whole process actually is. So it was kind of an interesting process for us to try to learn as much as we can to kind of frame our experience in Paris, but also recognize that there are a reason why people kind of dedicate their entire lives to that specific process. So within that framework, the way it worked out was there was a student a couple years ago that had applied for this UN delegation status for McAllister. So they kind of took the initiative, and I guess we reaped the benefit a little bit of that to have that opportunity to go to Paris. And kind of the focus of the trip was, one, a learning endeavor for ourselves, as well as a chance to connect back to our local communities. So one of the biggest pieces that we focused on were different dissemination projects. How can we kind of leverage our experience in Paris and kind of, I guess, be like torchbearers in some capacity to bridge the gap between those who are really interested in these conferences and what's happening kind of on the other side of the world, and connect back with the local community. So within our different focus groups, different people have, published different publications. If you're interested in seeing some of what the other students have done with some of their dissemination projects, I could follow up with an email and kind of share some of those pieces and some of those reflections, because the focal points for each individual student was different. Although I'm kind of an economics background and actually don't particularly identify with a specific faith group, my focus was the interfaith community and their action there. And the reason I chose that myself was I read Pope Francis' encyclical Laudato Si the summer prior, just as something of personal interest to read, and was just blown away by it, and kind of viewed that kind of very humanizing and moralizing component to the climate change discussion as very unifying, and was really curious to see, especially coming from someone who's more secular, if other people were sensing that, if that was kind of an underlying tone of the Paris conferences as well. So that was my personal focus at the conference, which was really interesting and dynamic, but other focus quite a bit on climate-induced migration was an area of focus for many students, as well as like politicians, mostly small-scale politicians, so mayors, and I'll comment on some interesting things that happened around that at the conference as well, and then agricultural movements like RED, which is a pretty prominent like fund that helps indigenous communities that have been more severely impacted by climate change. So a diverse set of focuses at the conference, which was really interesting for us to kind of engage with one another as we kind of focused our research prior to the conference and then in Paris itself. But I guess to comment on Paris itself, I think the way I hope to structure this was kind of tell a series of short stories of specific interactions and experiences I had while in Paris, and then kind of tie those into some of the underlying themes and outcomes I felt from the conference itself. And then kind of through that, as questions arise, and towards the end, I'd love to just kind of chat about some of those. But I think one thing, and this was a pretty strong piece of the conference itself, especially leading up to it, was the terrorist attacks that happened in Paris 2 weeks before. And I think that that's a really important piece of the entirety, not just thinking about Paris at that time, but the world at that time. And I remember in dialogues leading up to the conference, many in the class were kind of, this is less a climate conference and more of a peace conference, if we can view it that way, as climate change doesn't just affect the climate, it affects people, it affects all of humanity in kind of this cross-cutting way. So immediately arriving in Paris, it was a police state. There were police everywhere. There was no cars on the road anywhere. There was nearly no pedestrians. So it was a very different dynamic when you kind of thought of the march that was supposed to take place, bringing thousands and thousands of people kind of in celebration, protest, action, to take part in the conference. So that was a different dynamic. But I think in reflecting on that right away, one brief story is, I think, in kind of the plenary speeches, and when all of these different world leaders, 196 countries, we watched these plenary speeches, and the rhetoric, what they were talking about, and in speaking with other individuals that have been at past COPs. So this was my first COP, so it was hard to have a reference point. But there was this kind of sense of optimism in the way these world leaders were speaking about the conference leading up to it, that was really palpable in those plenary discussions. And it was also hectic, the way the city was set up and the conference itself. I mean, there's dignitaries from, I think there was over 40,000 people at this conference. So I think very early on in the first couple days, I had trouble stepping back and reflecting on the significance of the events, just going from moment to moment. So I phoned one of my friends in McAllister. I said, you've been to Paris before. Where should I go to kind of just take a moment and step back and reflect on the significance of this beyond just the conference? And he said, okay, I've got the perfect plan for you. Get a bottle of wine, a box of crackers, and find a friend and go walk along this canal in the evening and kind of see the lights reflect on the water and just kind of sit down and just chat and kind of be in Paris. So I got one of my good friends and we did that. We got our bottle of wine and our crackers and walked around, and this was after the day of the conference, right, to kind of sit there and reflect. And we were walking along and we realized halfway through when we kind of found that beautiful spot with the lights kind of shimmering on the water, kind of share this moment and kind of start this reflection process early on. We had forgot a bottle opener. So I'm sitting there with a bottle of wine. I was like, oh my goodness, what do I do? What do I do? And my good friend is like, well, I heard if you stick a key in it, the serrated edge can catch a hold of the cork and you can dislodge it. So I'm sitting there on this bridge over this canal and I'm like yanking, my hands turning purple and blue. I can't even get the cork out. And I was like, oh my goodness, like, oh, this moment's going to be ruined. And there's a little park on the side of the canal that we were like, okay, like, I heard that didn't work clearly. I heard if you stick, I was actually wearing these shoes, come to think of it. If you stick a bottle of wine in a shoe and hit it securely against something, you can dislodge the cork. It's like, all right, we'll try that. And so we step off to the side in this little park, and I take off my shoe, I stick the bottle of wine in, and I bang, and I hear this like whoosh as if I've dislodged the cork, and no, it's flush, nothing happened. But in that moment, from out of the corner of my eye, there was this like glistening light coming from like a bush on the side of the park. And I'm like, okay, what is this? And I hear a voice, this sound, and we kind of walk over, and it isn't a light. It's this metallic glistening of the lights reflecting off of a bottle opener, emitting from a bush out of a hand, and behind this bush there was a gentleman that had been sleeping, that we had woken up. And at first I felt horrific that I had... And the reason I share this moment when I reflect on the Paris experience, I think it's significant in talking about kind of the Islamophobia or the refugee phobia, this kind of sense in Paris in light of the attack in a city in recovery. There was not a moment of fear of approaching this man, this kind of foreign man in Paris who knows? Was he a refugee? I have no idea. Was he just a man in Paris out of luck, a homeless man? Or perhaps was he just a man taking a nap at this park in the middle of the night? I have no idea. But in that moment, he offered us his bottle opener. We didn't speak French. He spoke French. There was no verbal communication. But we kind of shared communion with him that evening with our bottle of wine and our crackers. And as I was reflecting early on in the conference, kind of the significance of the event, when I was thinking about kind of the world event, I was getting this sense, and in Paris, this like sense of deep resiliency, which was really important for me to see. And as I said, in the conference itself, this sense of optimism, of what could happen, and in this specific moment with this man at that moment, hope for what might come for the conference. So that was kind of like the leading moment for the conference for me, which is funny to reflect on that because it was outside of the conference. But as I said, I think that it's important to kind of understand the dynamic of the conference itself with reference to the attacks that had taken place as we were moving forward. So that was a really fun moment for us. And then as the conference continued. As I said, that many of the public and civil society displays had been shut down, but instead people found these really beautiful and innovative ways to kind of interact with the conference and interact in a meaningful way for them. So instead of the march, there was a moment where the Place de République, where one of the shootings took place, instead of a congregation, because they had kind of said, we don't want people congregating, 10,000 pairs of shoes were placed. And we were able to visit this moment. It was the second night in Paris. I said the first night, it was a 2-minute walk from our hotel where one of the shootings had taken place. And there was a memorial service. There were artifacts that were left from those who had lost their lives in the attacks. There were thousands of candles lit and 10,000 pairs of shoes that were set kind of in a moment of like solidarity, a moment to say, you know, we may not be able to stand here as people, but we're still here. Still, this moment is important for us, and we want to make that known. So that was another really powerful moment with respect to the like starting off in the beginning of the conference itself. And then in the conference itself, one of the things that I focused on was an individual by the name of Yeb Sanyo, who was a delegate to the Philippines. Who is very, very famous for a speech he made. I want to say it's 2009 or 13. Those dates seem significant for some reason. It's one of the two, when Typhoon Haiyan, hit the Philippines, and it was as he was giving the opening speech, and since then he's kind of been the kind of catalytic piece of the Fast for the Climate movement, and I don't know if people are familiar with that, but he kind of in this opening speech said, it's hard to determine, was this typhoon a case of increased severe climate events? It's very possible that that was the case, and he was just saying that, this is real for me. I don't know where my brother is. I don't know where my family are right now. They're being impacted by this event. And since then, he's helped organize this Fast for the Climate, which is kind of on the first of every month of fast in solidarity with those who suffer most severely from climate change, both as a form of prayer, a form of recognition of those across the world, and kind of a unifying component to have people across the world kind of unified in one moment of recognition. But he and many others did a pilgrimage, over a 600-mile pilgrimage, walking not to Paris, but through Paris. And that's what I wanted to reflect here. I spoke with him, and I did some coverage on the Fast for the Climate as he was speaking there. And then there was both the fast and the breaking of the fast moment in Paris, kind of, again, in celebration of kind of the hopeful respect of what the Paris Agreement could potentially become. And the rhetoric that he used again and again, as I said, was this is not a walk to Paris, but a walk through Paris. And that kind of just like simple rhetoric choice in the way they approached this Fast for the Climate and the pilgrimage itself, I thought was interesting in light to like think a little bit more about the policy that came out of the Paris Agreement itself. But one of the big pieces that's very new is this 5-year reporting mechanism that the Paris Conference itself, the agreement, is what's called soft law. So it's not an actual legally binding agreement. But what it does do is it has this piece to it where every 5 years you must report on the contribution that you've made. So the INDCs, right? Individually, nationally determined contributions, which is a very new piece of the conference, and I thought it was really fascinating, the parallel right there. So there's this kind of civil society movement speaking to, this is a step, this is a significant step, this needs to take place, but this is only the foundation from which we need to do things in the future. That the work is going to take place after we make this initial agreement, and I thought that piece of the agreement itself reflected that now there is a mechanism to say every 5 years you have to actually say what you've done, and the hope is that that will in turn kind of maybe cause a competition between, but kind of have a reporting mechanism where people are held accountable, where countries are held accountable. So I thought that was a significant piece, and just in commenting on the nature of the soft law, and again, this is something that I've only kind of discussed within my classroom and with others, but I wouldn't call myself a policy expert. But one thing that was really important, I think, to think about there is in the past, the U.S. at these negotiations has been perceived as the laggard, right? The ones in behind. And I think that's been very true for a really long time, and I can't so much reflect on that having not been at past conferences. But one thing that my professor shared with me, Rupali, and some of the others that were in the formal diplomatic zone, so there were 2 zones at the conference, the actual kind of a civil society space and a formal diplomatic blue zone. I was primarily focused in the civil society space, but one thing that they focused on was actually over the past 5 or 6 years, the U.S. kind of positionality at these conference has changed. And in the past, people have felt kind of ashamed to say, I'm part of the U.S. delegation, because the U.S. delegation wasn't doing very much. But the perceptions from those that were in the conference was the U.S. delegates were running around. They were pushing for 1.5. They were pushing for 1.5. That's an incredibly big step to make. So I thought that was, again, a really interesting, reassuring piece. And kind of commenting on that too, of who's lagging behind and who's kind of pushing forward. I spoke at an event with J. Drake Hamilton, who's works for Fresh Energy, and she was part of a delegation in Paris as well. So she's from Minneapolis and does phenomenal work. She's incredible. But they had this organization, CAN, which is Climate Action Network. And each day at the conference, they posted this kind of comedic piece that was called the Fossil of the Day. And the fossil of the day was the country who on that day was holding back the negotiations the most, right? So who was in the way of pushing the negotiations forward? And at the moment in Paris, I remember seeing these. They made these big displays and kind of had a recording. It was comedic, but it was fun. It was engaged, and I never really knew exactly what was going on. I saw it happening, and it wasn't until 3 weeks ago that I spoke with Drake that, in fact, I found out kind of what the impact of that fossil of the day was. She was telling the story that on one of those days, Norway, who part of the these northern European countries who are highly touted for their renewable energy, that are doing significant things, or kind of that perception from the United States, at least that I feel as well, they gave Norway the fossil of the day for kind of a lack of focus and legislation on renewable energy and wind in specific. And that evening, this was played nationally in Norway, and the next day, legislation was passed to change that piece. And I think it was significant, because I thought it was fascinating that I had seen this fossil of the day and thought it was kind of fun and comedic, but actually that this, in that event, was impacting policy. It was moving things forward to say that, okay, we're kind of finding these innovative ways to push people, especially people that we perceive to be on the front end already. And it was continuing to kind of push that forward. So that was really fun to see that actually had some impact. And Drake was commenting on that and having that be a really fun example of one of the fun things they were doing. Of course, they were in the back rooms doing all these other very serious negotiations, but that actually that piece had impact in and of itself was really cool. Was really cool to hear. And then that policy piece of things was something that it was harder to get a feel for, and I think it was probably very possible focused in the civil society zone. One thing that I will comment on is this blue zone, green zone, the divide between the civil society, so national organizations and different student delegations like myself, for the first time ever was in a neighboring space to the diplomatic zone. In the past, they've separated them to kind of say, okay, the diplomats are going to do their thing and kind of let the civil society be isolated in a way, almost, in my opinion, to almost discredit that voice. But for the first time, they were in neighboring venues, which means there was kind of a crossover. Not to say it was always, one side was always listening to the other, but I thought that was another piece of Paris that often isn't well known, or something that this was again one of those areas in which change was happening, subtle change. But that was an important piece, and that I remember. So President Hollande of France, I was from here to the table, away from him. I mean, he was surrounded by like 30 people, but that there was a crossover, and he was coming in, and other dignitaries and other world leaders actually came into the civil society space and were engaging in that way. Now, the outcomes of those engagements I can't fully comment on myself, but the fact that they made that decision I thought was a hopeful sign, and hopefully indicative of more of kind of a unification in this model of, it's not just one actor, it's a group of actors. It's everyone has kind of a stake in this, and therefore everyone's voice should be heard in some capacity. But I mean, in kind of reflecting on the experience for me, I think so much of the news reporting surround Paris, and I think this is always going to be the case, was, yes, this happened, but this is not enough. And I think that you can't escape that. You absolutely cannot escape that. And I think many people ask, why was this not legally binding? Why was that not the case? And I think I have read criticisms of the United States for not making it legally binding. And I think one interesting piece for me, at least from my personal standpoint, as I understand it, is, interestingly enough, were it to be a legally binding agreement, that would have to go before the United States Congress. Were it to go before the United States Congress, that would not be ratified. Our Congress would not pass it. So these interesting, there's the surface level outcomes, and then there's kind of a reasoning behind those outcomes as to why that took place, that I think is important to know. And it can be very difficult to kind of be lost in the fold and track all of those underpinnings. And by no means am I satisfied. But with respect to the atmosphere, the push, the observed change, and the optimism felt by those who had been at past COPs. And that's what I think try to hold with me most when I kind of retell and talk about my experiences, is that I think it can be very difficult seeing the kind of bureaucracy of the UN, the bureaucracy of what's happening between world leaders and those agendas clashing. But on an individual level, not framing it as, let's throw our hands up and just, we can't deal with that. One of the projects of the students actually, and I thought was really, really cool to see, was one of the outcomes of this neighboring the UN conferences was there was representative of, I think, over 500 mayors from across the world were in Paris. And these mayors got together and said, this is something that we want to do on the local level. This is something that we believe in. We believe is important for our communities. And together they kind of drafted this kind of mayor ordinances of things that they, as individuals, and more local acting political leaders, were going to work to change. And I think we see that as really hopeful that may be where the change is going to happen first. And the more people that start to kind of see that rhetoric taking place and see that sense of optimism and hope, that's how you engage more people too, because it's proven over and over again that those that don't want to engage in these discussions, when you approach them with this, okay, like, you're doing everything wrong, like, you need to just change because you are wrong, that rhetoric is not taking place. So this sense of retelling the story, although there's always growth to be told, there's growth to be had, there's always advances to be made, but framing it in a positive light is something that I feel strongly about. And this is, how do I articulate this in the best way, but this is something that I think, with respect to my kind of really incredible privilege of having been at the conference, I think there's a lot of people that wanted to be engaged in somehow, but it's in another country, worlds away, across the Atlantic. Like, how do you engage with that? And then your perceptions of that conference are coming through the media, or coming from reports. I kind of hope that when I take it upon myself and talk to people, that I can share these moments that were optimistic, that were hopeful, and hopefully that will kind of continue to engage people in a way that says, change can be had. And there are positive things that are coming out of these discussions, and this was a positive step forward. This was a positive step forward. And I feel it's important to frame this conference and future discussions in that light, because so often that is what inspires people to continue to make steps forward, as opposed to saying kind of things are falling apart, which is
paralyzing.
Yeah, that's the word. That's a great way to think of it. Paralyzing.
Thank you.
Yeah, and so those are some specific moments in Paris, and I'm sure there are many others. And I mean, there were definitely cases in which I saw things that I did not like to see, or just like really interesting insights about the power dynamics at the conference itself. I think one interesting thing that I've shared with with a few is that, were I to, so I saw President Hollande, but would I have been able to ever talk to that individual? Would I have been able to approach him and actually engage with him as a U.S. citizen and the president of another country? Probably not. But I went to another speech, which was where the president of Palau spoke, so a small island state, and I walked straight in. There was no security. No one checked me once. And after the speech, I walked straight up to the president of a country and spoke to him directly. And I mention that because I think it's reflective on an area in which steps do need to be taken, in that we talk about whose voice is heard at these conferences. How do these power dynamics play out? Well, I think those two different examples of who I was able to interact with is indicative of whose voice is being heard the most. And again, reflecting on the impacts of climate change, oftentimes, for instance, the president of Palau, the Philippines, small island states, who is most impacted by these outcomes, right? And whose voice is not heard as much. So I thought that was a piece that we reflected on in one of our blog posts, and I think another student reflected on in one of their articles, to raise awareness to that too, of while there's positive change happening, it also is important to continually reflect and ensure and push for equal representation in the negotiations themselves. I think is an important piece, and one takeaway just from a personal experience that I thought was really important moving forward.